I had a good time playing through SteamWorld Dig 2. A direct sequel to the 2013 3DS title, which was, unbeknownst to me, released on just about every other platform, and the third, technically fourth installment in the SteamWorld pantheon by Swedish studio Image & Form Games. I was pretty indifferent to the franchise. I never played Dig 1 or Heist, but knew they were highly lauded for their look, engrossing gameplay, and satisfyingly bite-sized length. After watching some early playthroughs, I eagerly downloaded Dig 2 on the day of release to round out my meager Switch lineup. I was excited to finally have a fun little indie game to curl up with in bed or make a few digging runs during my lunch break at work. It helps that SteamWorld Dig 2 has super appealing art direction and looks crisp on the Switch's handheld screen. I never played this game docked because I pretty much busted through the game in 3 or 4 sittings, mostly at my desk. Regardless, Dig 2 stuck its hooks into me early with its addictive tunnel diving, mineral collecting, and light platforming challenges. There are a ton of ways to upgrade Dot the protagonist right from the get-go, and everything feels equally important and handy. You obviously do a lot of digging, and a shiny new pick would do wonders for efficiency as well as combat capabilities, but you got water, light, and even health to worry about as well. The beginning hours teach you the basics of digging and platforming in a closed environment before letting you carve out your own path. The controls are fluid and responsive, with a satisfying amount of floatiness for quick corrections mid-air and an added sense of speed. Combat is pretty simple and repetitive, but it gets the job done since it's never really the focus. What matters is digging and exploration. But the game starts you off with an annoyingly short leash in the form of your lantern. You only get what feels like seconds in the mine before your light starts to burn out. Now, it sounds good on paper because it grounds you in this world. As a miner, of course you need a source of light. It's meant to make your upgrades feel meaningful and offer a sense of progression. It even incentivizes you to mine efficiently lest you get stuck in the dark and struggle to climb out or miserably dig in the dark for the next warp checkpoint. I get it. It's supposed to have this nice risk versus reward where pressing on to the next checkpoint without a light may lead to a big payoff as opposed to the arduous climb up the way you came. But let me hit you with a few complaints I have with this system. First of all, the lantern is basically a glorified timer. Bigger lantern, longer timer. That's it. Doesn't really add a whole lot since you're already heavily limited by inventory space and health and such. The challenge should be either can you make it quickly down the mine shaft to the checkpoint before your lamp goes out without taking damage and losing your items, or can you reach the checkpoint in enemy territory while carrying a full pouch of valuables. The latter is the Dark Souls equivalent, which works really well, and the former is just counterintuitive. Secondly, in addition to the timer being a sucky inclusion in general, the early game is where you have to be the most careful and your pick takes the longest to mine effectively. Everything is at odds with the lantern and it makes the beginning grind for money feel more arduous than it needs to be. Without any of the upgrades you find in the mines, Dot is only capable of digging 1 block in 4 directions, an extra block left or right if you creep over an edge, and she can jump and do a sort of wall climb by mashing the jump button. That's it. And it's extremely easy to dig yourself into a literal pit. Not to mention falling rocks and enemies can ruin your shaft and cause frustrating situations to climb out of with your limited mobility. So the game trains you to play very cautiously and dig very thoughtfully with an escape route in mind. It works well and is reminiscent of Minecraft, but the whole time the clock is ticking, making return trips all too frequent. And last, but certainly not least, after only a few upgrades which only offer a meager minute to your timer, you can slot in 3 measly upgrade cogs, which can be found all over after completing challenges, to completely nullify the lantern system altogether. From the first hour onward, you will never run out of light, and never have to leave the mine until you're good and ready. Like, what the actual heck? Did the developers realize they have to keep the crappy system from the first game for continuity's sake and then quickly abandon it? Now, I don't know if Dig 1's lantern would have annoyed me quite so much, but at least then they stuck with it and presumably built around its functionality. So why complain so much about the lantern when there's an easy solution? Well, like the video title says, I think SteamWorld Dig 2 suffers from a bit of an identity crisis. The developers have said that this is the culmination of the Dig series and they wanted to explore every possibility. It ends up feeling like upgrades get tacked on and abandoned at a rapid pace. You adapt to one playstyle and then leapfrog into another one in one fell swoop. For example, at first you can only scale a continuous wall. This works well, and if you're anything like me, you'll snake your way down the mine shaft in long lateral sweeps to avoid fall damage or trapping yourself without an escape route. Then you can make long shortcuts down through the safe areas to wall climb back out of. It becomes a methodical Zen-like experience with quite a few interesting considerations since climbing out can be so treacherous. Enter the grappling hook, an early upgrade which now allows you to cling to walls and ceilings within a screen's distance. I really enjoyed this upgrade since it felt like a logical progression and quality of life upgrade. It made scaling a lot easier, and you didn't have to be as careful about making clean and easy to navigate tunnels. This simple item greatly speeds up the pace of the experience since you can make more mistakes, dig a little more haphazardly, and react on the fly if you or your enemies destroy the environment too much. The grappling hook also opens up some fun platforming challenges, and it feels really good to snap around in all 4 directions. I even began to master scaling ceilings and momentum boosting myself upwards to bypass outcroppings in the walls. It even acts as an extendable attack for pesky flying critters and triggering explosives. The hook offers a variety of uses, speeds up gameplay, and increases the freedom of exploration. Now enter the jetpack. Not obtainable until considerably later, but early enough that it once again shattered my previous methods for exploring. No longer bound to any tunnels whatsoever, the jetpack is the logical conclusion in giving complete freedom of exploration to dedicated players. No area is out of reach now, and any notions of cleverly constructed mine shafts are thrown completely out. Gliding negates fall damage, clinging to walls and ceilings grants infinite flying power, and bashing your head against everything is a quick and dirty way to bypass most enemies, and even negates the need to dig in some cases. Now you can go about blasting away the rubble to your heart's content, leaving nothing behind but a gaping maw. Of course, meticulous players could feasibly clear the entire mine and simply wall jump their way out again, but Dig 2's endgame is nearly unrecognizable from where it begins. That's not even to mention all the overpowered cog upgrades available to switch out endlessly up in town. Never worry about your lantern, never take damage underwater, fly forever, shoot missiles in midair, trivializing a lot of puzzles, and recharge those missiles indefinitely. Even teleport out of the mine for free. But here's where I have my reservations, because the argument is, well, those are optional upgrades that aren't necessary to complete the game. There are already cog mods intended to make the game harder by introducing wacky conditions like exploding enemies or lowered health drops. And of course, if you grind in any game, you're setting yourself up for an easier experience. I've never been a big fan of crafting the ultimate weapon in a big RPG and then curb stomping the final boss, but I do like collecting that ultimate weapon just for the sense of completion. So in SteamWorld Dig 2's case, I don't have to collect all the cogs or even fully upgrade all my items to play the game at a satisfying difficulty. But therein lies the issue, because straddling that difficulty curve on your first run is nearly impossible, or at worst, a frustrating game of chicken or trial and error. The upgrades feel good, they're amazing rewards, and the game doesn't have enough collectible cogs to max out every mod, so you still have to pick and choose which abilities you want to have. Now, there are a lot of mods made useless once you have everything, but regardless, the game's enjoyment is incredibly flexible. At its best, it's a nail-biting, resource-managing dungeon crawler with unique and mind-bending puzzles and twitch reflex platforming. At its worst, it's a piss-easy 2D shooter with increasingly less interesting rewards and barely any platforming. In comparison, one of my favorite 2D games of all time, Cave Story, has a lot in common with the endgame of Dig 2. You start off in cramped tunnels or caves. Hey, look at that. And eventually into more open areas with increasingly demanding platforming before unlocking a limited jetpack or an optional more powerful jetpack. All the while, the game's core mechanic, the shooting and experience system, remains unaltered by these movement changes. More powerful weapons are balanced to later enemy types, and your movement options become more demanding and complex as you progress. And by the end, you've mastered the controls and can tackle a final challenge level that puts your movement abilities to the test without introducing new mechanics. It satisfies that feeling of progression and player empowerment without breaking the game's difficulty. Now, there are ways to make things easier by taking different paths, but thorough exploration strikes a good balance of feeling meaningful but never overpowered. Dig 2's equivalent to Cave Story's Bloodstained Sanctuary are the final secret trials. Sure, the final boss is pretty nasty if you're not decked out in the strongest mods, but this 7-part gauntlet is truly an unapologetic nightmare, even if the final reward would claim that they're sorry. These trials introduce a ton of unique mechanics in the last possible minute. Even 10 hours of experience and 100% completion was not enough to prepare me for these trials. One in particular requires mastery of until now completely unutilized jumping mechanics in a very high-stress scenario with zero training or explanation. Apparently, Dig 2 has a pretty complex momentum and wall jumping system, which you'd never know in a tight quarters mining simulator. especially after you abandon the need for wall jumping or even the grappling hook by the end and entirely depend on the jetpack, which is heavily needed in most of the trials as well as getting to them in the first place. It may look pretty easy in the footage, but that's only because almost 15% of my total playtime has been spent mastering obscure, unnecessary, unintuitive parkour techniques for one room in an optional endgame gauntlet. Now that's poor game design. Now take a look at these Vectron guys. You encounter them in the story, so it's not a new mechanic, but the only experience you've had with them is running away in a straight line or simply avoiding them. And if you don't get the perfect running start, they can quickly catch up to you and trap you in an endless barrage until you die. You have to, on the fly, suss out that you can barely squeak by them if you get them to jump in just the right way to slow down their momentum or hole up in these notches in the ceiling, but then you're susceptible to the exploding electro skulls. The only thing I can think of is tanking the damage and hoping you get a near flawless run on the other 6 trials, of which 4 are still super nasty. It's entirely insane to me that not only are each of these 7 trials gruelingly difficult, but they all need to be completed in random order in a single run. And I do not have the patience to reset for a favorable order of trials to practice the ones I suck at, especially if I have to keep doing the long parkour trial just to die in the Vectron one. I appreciate the thought of having a super challenging optional zone at the very end for the most dedicated players, but it's such a departure from the main game that it absolutely solidified my theory of the game's identity problems, as well as completely souring my entire experience. Let's say you're playing an action game with a slow, methodical battle system like Dark Souls, but by the end you're chaining flashy combos like Bayonetta after receiving a single item from defeating a mandatory boss. Or you're playing Super Mario Bros. And after completing World 8, you were thrust into an optional final world which contained the hardest levels from Super Meat Boy, giving you no time to learn the completely new game mechanics. That's what SteamWorld Dig 2 feels like. Not to say any of those games are better than the others, but you can't introduce such drastically different playstyles without changing the world to accommodate for it. For one, the deliberate digging style of the opening hours is completely abandoned in favor of flying around blasting everything that moves with ore magnetically drawn to you. Enemies don't react or pose any more of a threat than they did before, but just by naturally progressing, you've become overpowered. And conversely, the bulk of the game doesn't prepare you for the immense spiking difficulty of the trials. Sure, the mines offer a Metroidvania-style progression with short environmental obstacles that require certain movement upgrades, but the bread and butter is still digging ore and defeating enemies in cramped corridors, and in my opinion that system is at its most enjoyable between the first and third hour of the game. The fact that I could even categorize the gameplay in at least 4 separate chunks speaks volumes to how drastic these movement upgrades break the game. So, I started a new file, and tried to play as faithfully to what I thought the game's strengths were. I played cautiously and tried to dig with my escape route in mind. I actively tried to avoid hunting excess cogs and use my hookshot and jetpack as seldom as I could put up with, but I just ended up falling into the same trappings. Without incentive to fully upgrade my gear, I left a lot of precious stone alone and rarely got into any deadly skirmishes, thus I spent a lot less time in the mines and found it incredibly straightforward to beeline from checkpoints without running out of light. Of course, I did upgrade my lantern and pop in those cogs because, seriously, why deal with that? But once the game hands you the hookshot and the jetpack, it's basically impossible to ignore the temptation to make your life easier. Without meticulously collecting every vein of gems or completing most of the optional challenges, the game is somehow even easier to breeze through. The fear of losing resources is gone, and it's pretty easy to knock out the main story in less than 4 to 5 hours. It's really a shame that Dig 2 couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Ultimately, a very pretty, fun-to-control little title, it ended up being an all-encompassing hodgepodge of ideas and systems. Like a big melting pot of gruel out on the open range, surrounded by beauty, but a bitter bite to swallow.